Welcome to an emergency edition of Andy Staples On 3. We got a weird one here. Jaden Rashada, former star recruit who was committed to Florida, signed with Florida, signed a very big deal with Florida's collective that was then terminated, has sued Florida head coach Billy Napier, former Florida recruiting staffer Marcus Castro-Walker, Florida mega donor Hugh Hathcock, and also Hugh Hathcock's since sold company, alleging fraud. This lawsuit was filed in federal court in Pensacola, bright and early Tuesday morning. Joined now by Pete Nakos, who's been working on this story for over a year. This is a lawsuit that has been cooking. This is something that Rusty Hardin, who's a very famous attorney in Texas, who's been working with Rashada for quite some time. This is something that they were looking into before Jaden Rashada committed to Arizona State. I will point out now, he has since transferred to Florida rival Georgia. Pete, how did this get to this point where they are filing a lawsuit in federal court?
Yeah, I mean, Andy, you've covered this extensively, and I have as well. This really all dates back to November 2022. Jaden Rashada flips his commitment from Miami to Florida that same night, as we now see in the lawsuit, and we had it reported on it in the time. He signed a $13.85 million deal that was set to be paid over 4 years. Ultimately, as this lawsuit lays out, that fell apart. For the Florida collective, the Gator collective, it's called, missed a $500,000 signing bonus on December 5th, 2022. And they ultimately opted to terminate the contract in a letter sent to Rashada and his camp on December 6th, 2022. And we can get into it, but a lot more happened after that as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing. A lot did happen. So what Rashada is basically saying is he's calling it fraud because he's saying that because this deal wasn't real, because they didn't pay the money that they had promised, that he passed on other deals, specifically one with Miami. In the lawsuit, they talk about a $9.5 million deal with Miami. Now, I know that Jaden Ruiz, who was the booster who was handling that deal, he has said to The Athletic, this was over a year ago, that it wasn't worth that much, but declined to say what it was actually worth. So we've got to deal with sort of he said in that situation. But we do know, and this is interesting in the lawsuit, this is something that I was at The Athletic when we wrote that big Rashada story. And one of the things that we wrote about in that story was that Rashada had paid $150,000 to pay back Miami's collective. The lawsuit shed some light on where that came from, because the lawsuit claims that Hugh Hathcock, the Florida donor, wired him that money in December of 2022 to pay back Jaden Ruiz.
Yeah, Hathcock's role was pretty big too. The lawsuit also details how in that previously summer after Jaden Rashada had committed to Miami, Hugh Hathcock made an offer in the range of $11 million to try to get Jaden Rashada to flip his commitment. And the lawsuit also lays out that Hugh Hathcock maybe even offered Jaden Rashada's father, Harlan Rashada, a job.
Yeah. And so where this gets interesting with Billy Napier, because that's what everybody wants to know. How does Billy Napier figure into all this? So if you read the lawsuit, it's a 38-page complaint. There are multiple text messages from Marcus Castro-Walker, who's one of the named defendants. He was the NIL guy in Florida's recruiting office at the time. And those, let's say this, Pete, if the NCAA rules governing NIL still existed, which right now they don't because they've been enjoined by a federal court, Florida would be cooked on that front. Yes. Because there is discussion of payments that would be considered an inducement to enroll, which was against those rules. That's not really the issue. The issue is how involved Napier was. And there's no text messages in the lawsuit from Napier. There is an accusation, and I'll throw it up there on the screen. Basically, an accusation that Hathcock promised $1 million. This is after the agreement gets nullified. Yep. That Hathcock, according to Rashada's attorneys, promised $1 million that would be wired to him so he would sign with Florida on National Signing Day. And there's an accusation that Napier basically assures that money's coming. to Rashada's father. Now, we have reached out to Billy Napier. We've not heard anything back. I'm assuming we will get a pretty strong denial from Billy Napier about this. And this is a he said. If they had text messages or recordings, I think they'd be in the lawsuit.
We've also reached out to Marcus Castro-Walker and sent him a follow-up text message that he's yet to comment on. The one thing I want to mention when we're still talking about this too, Andy, is the lawsuit goes on to say that the defendant, Castro-Walker, leveraged the coach's promise that Napier would get it done and threatened on National Signing Day that if Jaden did not sign the national letter of intent with Florida, Napier could walk away from Jaden Rashada entirely.
Which ultimately, that's what they walked away from each other. But yeah, it's a very interesting situation. So let's set the scene. This is National Signing Day 2022, or the early signing day for the 2023 class in December 2022. Yeah. Billy Napier is about to go up to talk at his press conference about the signing class. Jaden Rashada's letter of intent is not in. We know now that's because this deal got revoked. That there's been all this back and forth, that they're trying to make a new deal. And so he's about to go up. Suddenly, he does not go up on time. He comes out an hour later, and they have Jaden Rashada's letter of intent at this point.
Yeah.
What happened in that hour is kind of what's at issue in this case.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Jaden Rashada never received the $1 million payment. And to go back in time a little, so I believe Andy and myself caught wind of this deal being terminated in early December when it happened. But we're like, okay, let's see how this plays out. And then everything happened on National Signing Day. And that's when I started to kind of report on this a little bit. And then he goes to the Under Armour All-American camp in early January, where he's all pro Gators and everything, but then he doesn't show up to campus on time. And that is when, if you think back to it, that's when we start to report about him being disgruntled, about asking for his release from his national letter of intent. And then he obviously ultimately was released and he lands at Arizona State. But that's the timeline here about how that relationship fell apart.
So Chris Callahan in the chat asks, could Florida be hoping he's involved so he's fired with cause? This is Billy Napier, the Tennessee method. That's exactly what Tennessee did with Jeremy Pruitt. So Pete, this is sort of uncharted territory because, again, if those NIL rules were in effect, you've got those text messages from Marcus Castro-Walker. We know the NCAA has been on Florida's campus. They've asked everybody about this. Presumably, they have all that stuff too.
Right.
But a federal court has issued an injunction against those rules.
Yeah.
The state of Florida just recently joined that case, which was filed by the states of Tennessee and Virginia initially. Like, I don't think they can do anything about this in terms of the NCAA piece of it. But it's interesting because if let's say that case had never been filed, the court had never enjoined it. If you've got Castro-Walker, based on the way the NCAA rules are currently written, you've got the head coach if you've got the assistant, because they can just dump whatever they want on the head coach.
And not only did that preliminary injunction enjoin the current NIL interim policy, but Charlie Baker then, like 2 weeks later, came out and said, we're halting all NIL investigations. And at that time, we already knew the NCAA would deny this. And then from there, I mean, it's going to be a he said sort of situation. And obviously, Jaden Rashada's and his attorney's point of view, they're suing for punitive damages. He never really saw any money from that $9.5 million deal at Miami, and he certainly didn't see any of that $13.85 million deal. At the end of the day, he got $150,000 from Hugh Hathcock to pay back to John Ruiz. So the way this is structured too, the way they chose who to sue is interesting to me as well, because they chose to sue Hugh Hathcock's company, which he has since sold. He sold it in 2023. It's called Velocity Automotive, and it's basically a bunch of like turnkey solutions for car dealers that help them do their jobs better. And a company called Velo acquired that. And you kind of wonder, are they trying to get the new parent company to just stroke a check to make it go away? I can't, here's the one thing I can't picture, even though, and I realize you and I have been reporting on the House versus the NCAA settlement, which was played out very publicly. Most settlements
do not play out publicly. They're very private. The idea, though, that Billy Napier would ever write a check to one of Georgia's quarterbacks, I don't think that's going to happen. Like, I can't see that happening.
So the other really big thing about the lawsuit that stuck out to me is Florida is not named as a defendant.
Correct.
When we started to hear about this lawsuit, there was a lot of investigating to see if they could mention Florida as a defendant, and then sovereign immunity comes up, and I think that's where the decision was obviously made not to include Florida. But obviously, a former employee and a current employee are mentioned in the lawsuit.
Diego in the chat says Marcus Castro-Walker, who has since moved on to the Las Vegas Raiders, says he's going to be the fall guy. No, he was going to be the fall guy.
Yep.
That was the plan originally. The plan has now changed, and we don't know what's going to happen. The University Athletic Association, which is the athletic department at Florida, their board was actually meeting Tuesday morning when this lawsuit dropped. So we have not heard anything from them yet. Again, Scott Strickland, the AD, not mentioned in this thing. The University of Florida, not mentioned in it. Like you said, sovereign immunity probably had a lot to do with that. And there's caps on damages that they would have to pay based on Florida state law. So it's definitely it's a mess. Diego, a question in the chat: isn't accepting money before you sign against NIL rules? It is,
yes,
but there are no rules right now. So.
And negotiating for that contract is actually completely legal in where we stand right now.
Yes.
So
yes, there's state laws that were actually potentially violated by the way the contract was structured. Sam in the chat, I love the little tidbit that Pete included in his story that Kirby Smart was aware of the lawsuit and signed off on it. Yeah. Well, listen, it wouldn't be college football unless you had that level of saltiness. Like, yes, the rival of, the coach of Florida's rival, because the guy's now on his roster, is going to get a heads up that this is getting filed.
Yeah. I mean, I was told that Jaden Rashada's attorney, Rusty Harden, has talked to Kirby Smart now a few times in the last 48 hours, and believe they were even on the phone again this morning.
Yeah, this is going to be very interesting. If this ever were to get to a discovery phase, a lot more stuff would come out. There's people not named in this lawsuit who would be deposed, who would probably tell their sides of the story that would add even more layers to this thing.
Sure.
But it is a giant mess. Now something Florida has to deal with, Billy Napier has to deal with, and we'll see how this affects him going forward. Because like everybody's like, what does this mean? Is he gonna get fired? Is he gonna have to pay Jaden Rashada? I have no idea.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you. Couldn't tell you. I mean, it's obviously a really pivotal year for Billy Napier, but at the same time, this lawsuit shows no evidence of text messages that Billy Napier sent. I guess we'll have to go to discovery, but there's no obviously exhibits attached that would insinuate voice recordings of Billy Napier. So
I think this all would have come out a lot sooner, or a check would have just been written if you had something like that.
No, I completely. Yeah.
So
I agree.
Michigan football in the chat with perhaps the most relevant question of all. Are lawsuits going to be part of the new EA College Football 25 video game now? God, I hope so. Just to make it truly authentic.
NIL collective mode, road to glory.
Pete Nakos, thank you for teaching us once again the only undefeated entity in college football is billable hours. We will follow this case as it goes forward. Thanks so much.
We will. Thanks, Andy.